Hi guys, make sure you guys have a pencil or a pen, a highlighter, and then make sure you guys get the note page from the what would be the substitute teacher. So today, guys, we're going to be talking about what would be the principles of the United States Constitution. So your two essential questions are: explain the different principles of the United States Constitution, and what are enumerated, concurrent, and reserved powers within what would be the United States Constitution. All right, so let's start with the notes here and talk about specifically, guys, what are principles of the United States Constitution. So basically, the way I define it is that government follows these principles when making laws and decisions. The principles that we will be outlining today are something known as popular sovereignty, limited government, rule of law, separations of powers, checks and balances, and what would be federalism. So a lot of things that we've already specifically talked about already that we're kind of already familiar with, and then you will kind of bring it all together, today with talking about what would be the United States Constitution. So let's talk about types of principles, and the first one is obviously popular sovereignty, and this is where the power of the government comes from the people. I've outlined this for many weeks now. Especially as we got into civics material. The power comes from us, and the power, specifically is through voting. So when you think of popular sovereignty, guys, you have to think of voting. But the power itself, power of the government comes from what would be the people, not the other way around. Number two is separation of powers. This was something that we talked about with Montesquieu. The government is divided into three branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative makes laws, the executive executes laws and carries out laws, and the judicial interprets the laws. So in the end, remember, you use the acronym Let's Eat Jello just to remember what would be those specific branches. But separations of power obviously divides the government into three different branches, and they all have different responsibilities within our own government. All right, let's talk about checks and balances. Each branch, guys, can check or limit the power of the other two branches in several ways. This is something, guys, where one branch can't become too powerful over the others. So each branch can limit the power of the other, in multiple ways, in several different ways. And this is why our government in some ways doesn't have a king or a queen, or has an unruly, what would be branch of government where they don't overstep their bounds. Each branch stays in their own lane. Each branch has their own power, and they have to stick to that power and responsibility that is outlined within the United States Constitution. Then you have what would be federalism. We know it as what would be the federal system, because we talked about that within systems of government. But the true, representation of what we're talking about here is, the idea of federalism is power is shared between the national and state governments. The national government has its own power, but also the state governments have their own power, and they share power with each other. Obviously, once again, under the Constitution, though, under the Supremacy Clause, specifically now, federal law, national law trumps what would be state law in any situation. All right, let's talk about the next, type of principle, and that is limited government. Very self-explanatory in the sense that the government can only do what the people allow it to do. The Constitution specifically says you can only do certain things and you can't do certain things. Our government is limited, and specifically because it goes back to the idea of what would be popular sovereignty. The people have the power, not the other way around. So once again, the Constitution limits the power of the national and federal government, but also the individual state governments as well too. Then you have what will be rule of law, which is also limits what would be government. It's the extension of what would be limited government. And I've kind of mentioned and talked about this before, but basically the law applies to everyone. No one is above the law. Even those who actually govern. So say, like, for example, the president is not above the law. A member of the House of Representatives, the United States Senate is not above the law. Someone that is on the Supreme Court is not above the law. This prevents tyrannical governments. It keeps them in their place because the law applies to everyone. No one is above the law. All right, so let's talk about the types of powers within what would be federalism. Okay, so there is three types of powers under what would be under our government. You have what would be something known as enumerated powers or express powers, which basically states that power is only given to the national government. Okay, so enumerated powers, guys, are outlined in the United States Constitution. These powers are only given to what would be the legislative branch, the executive branch, or what would be the judicial branch. So some examples being like declare war, provide an army and a navy, regulate trade. These are all powers that are only given to the national government, so specifically within Washington, D.C. So the next type of power is what would be known as reserve powers, powers only given to state governments. So examples being run elections, establish local governments, regulate state trade. So these powers, guys, are only given to what would be the 50 states. So if you want to get more specific, running elections, establishing local governments, and regulate state trade, those are powers given to our government in Tallahassee within Florida. So reserve powers are only powers given to individual state governments. Then you have something known as concurrent powers, where powers that the national and state government share. So that idea of federalism, or what will be known as a federal system. Both national governments and state governments can issue taxes. Both can establish courts at the federal level, the national level, but also at the state level, and both can enact and enforce the law within what would be those areas. So concurrent powers, guys, are powers that the national government and state government share. So the essence of what would be federalism. All right, so I highly suggest, after I'm done talking here, that you guys, pause the video and then you guys copy down this chart within your guys' notes. But it kind of gives you guys an idea, specifically some different examples of what would be express powers. So powers given to what would be the national government, concurrent powers. So powers that are shared between the national and state governments. And then you have reserve powers, which is the powers that are only given to the states. So make sure, guys, after I'm just done talking here, you guys copy down this chart within your guys' notes. Just put it on the right side of your notes. All right, guys, so you guys can start finishing up your guys' notes. Make sure you guys highlight or underline key information. You guys have 3 left side questions, and that your summary answers the essential questions. Make sure you guys use details from your notes to answer the essential questions, and make sure you guys be specific. Don't be vague with what will be your guys' summaries. All right, thanks, guys.